performance nutritionist, part-time at Leeds Rhinos Academy and Scholarship, doing my PhD here at Leeds Beckett University. And today I'm going to be talking about the energetic demands of professional adolescent rugby league players. That's what my PhD is focused on. So if you're a coach, an athlete, an S&C coach working with a rugby player at a school, a rugby league player at a school, all the way through to a senior athlete at professional standard, this information is of relevance to you. If you're worried about body composition, if they're overfueling, if you're worried about your athlete not putting on size or mass or meeting energy demands, then they're potentially underfueling. If you're worried about your athletes coming to training, be able to work as hard as they need to be to get the training stimulus, which this whole conference has been about, maximising training adaptations, it all comes back to, are they eating enough? Are they overeating? Can we maximise that training response? Are we maximising recovery from that training stimulus? So total energy expenditure, you want to know what your athletes are expending, and that's made up of a number of different components. So you've got basal metabolic rate plus arousal equals resting metabolic rate. And that's the amount of energy they need to stay alive at rest. And that makes up the largest component of someone's total energy expenditure because most people aren't very physically active. Now for athletes it doesn't because they're quite active. The thermic effect of food, which is the amount of energy you need to digest the food that you eat. For a rugby player, they have a high protein diet, so that's going to be quite large. Adaptive thermogenesis, which we're not going to focus on too much today. And then you come down to physical activity level. So how active is your athlete across the season, which we're all really interested in. If you divide someone's total energy expenditure by the resting metabolic rate, you get a PAL, or physical activity level. And that means we can compare how active different animals or different people are across different sports. So again, really interesting. We'll talk through that literature today. So how are we going to assess total energy expenditure? It basically comes down to heat, how much heat is someone producing, direct and indirect calorimetry, which is just a Latin and Greek word put together, calor, heat, metron, measure. Direct is the heat that someone produces or it dissipates, and you have to put them in a metabolic chamber. The second one is indirect calorimetry, and that's the measure of how much oxygen someone's consuming. So we know the energy cost per litre of oxygen that someone consumes. If you measure CO2 production as well, you can work out which fuels they're burning. So are they burning carbohydrate? Are they burning fat? And then from that, you can get an energy expenditure. Why is this important? Again, going through the metabolic demands of the game, adolescent rugby players can do anything from 30 to 50 tackles during a match. Dan Weaving's done some fantastic work in this space, showing that you can do up to 18 collisions in a peak 10-minute period. That's a collision every 113 metres. These collisions are large. So up to 10 gravitational force, which is similar to NFL. Ultimately, they define the sport. In pre-season periods, our adolescent athletes can cover anything up to 20 kilometres. That's similar to professional players. Obviously, training 5 days a week. These are professional demands. And these guys are young guys. They're going through the second stage of growth in the lifespan, second only to infancy. They have huge home-based loads. So Charlotte Hinchcliffe has done some fantastic work of her PhD, and she's shown that adolescent rugby players have up to 86 individual demands placed upon them, from developing peer relationships, so it might be friendships, or it might be a love-based relationship, anything to physiological demands. So we had sensor armbands on the player across pre-season periods. On top of all the training they were doing, they were taking up to 100,000 steps a week on average. That's a huge demand that you're not really accounting for. Some of these guys need to put on 30 kg in 2 to 3 seasons if they want to play senior professional rugby. They need a huge amount of energy. So it's really, really important we understand these demands. And as James Moran coined nicely, they really are in a league of their own. The inflammation markers of the game of rugby league are severe. And we'll talk about the energetic consequences of that. And it really comes down to, are you fueling your athlete adequately for training, adequately for training adaptation, for training recovery, for match recovery, and ultimately for health. Firstly, James Moran looked at energy expenditures of senior professional rugby league players in season, expending on average 5,500 calories per day. A Tour de France cyclist will go through 6,000 calories per day during a Tour de France, which is considered by most as like one of the most grueling events in sport. These guys are doing it during a typical week. So big take-home messages from this first study in 2016. One, they have very large energy expenditures, much larger than we would have ever predicted. They had low resting metabolic rates, and that's in red because I'm going to mention that later, and it's an interesting one. You would expect it to be high. If you're looking at professional football players using W-labeled water, energy expenditure was much lower. So 3,500 calories per day on average in season. This was a 2-game week. Even though they run a similar amount per game, why were those energy expenditures so much lower, despite running potentially up to 10 kilometers more per week, similar amount of accelerations, decelerations? What's causing that? Now, this is coming on to Debbie's research, which has recently been published, much larger population, which is fantastic, again, using W label water. She looked at the differences between codes. So was there a difference in energy expenditure between rugby union and rugby league? She showed that there wasn't. There was an unclear difference. Looks like there wasn't a difference, but there was large individual variation. Again, it confirms the huge energy expenditures of professional rugby players. 44 bananas a day just to maintain weight. Obviously, you probably start thinking, where's that energy going to come from? Do they have the support to achieve that? How do we know if they're eating enough? And if you look at it across age groups, so Debbie again looked at the difference between under 16-year-old players, under 19-year-old players, and under 24-year-olds. As you can see, there was actually unclear differences, but it looks like there was an age-related difference in energy expenditure per age group. Now, what is causing that difference? We know as players get older, they get bigger. They put on muscle mass, they put on size. So it's likely down to the body weight of the athlete. And this was shown really nicely when you look at individual data in Debbie's data set. So she showed one 14-year-old player at 60 kg expended on average 3,000 calories, whereas a 24-year-old player at 120 kg was up at 7,600. To give you an indication, that's one of the nearest highest energy expenditures you'll see across sport. Nordic skiers are around 9,000. The highest energy expenditures we could expect to physically see might be around 12,000 per day. So it gives you an indication just how much food that person would need to eat. And you might be thinking, how are my props still fat if they need to eat that much food? It's a good question, I'm not sure. That's 15 Big Macs. Some people might think they could eat that. What does all this literature tell us before we delve in some of the stuff that we've done that is currently unpublished? So one, they have distinct energetic demands. Two, these appear to exceed running demands. So where's that energy coming from? And likely related to body mass and body position, although we don't have evidence for that at the moment. So again, where's this energy coming from? And if we look at the game of rugby, it's clear to see that collisions define our sport. They're large, they're maximal, and they're frequent. So do collisions increase total energy expenditure? And what we showed was that those 10 collisions, or 20 collisions, significantly increased total energy expenditure by 1,200 calories. Now, if you think of how many collision sessions you would expect in a typical rugby season, you would probably do a collision session on a Tuesday and then a match on a Saturday or a Sunday, or in pre-season you might do collision sessions on a Saturday and a Tuesday and a Saturday. Your energy expenditure is going to be increased for the next 5 days. So it falls back into that idea that the bigger the player, the larger the energy expenditures, probably the bigger the collisions as well, and the more mass they just have to carry. So what does this mean? And essentially I think it's really, really exciting because it begins to explain all of the descriptive research that's currently published. The distinct energy expenditures that we've shown with gold standard techniques and other research groups have shown is probably most likely down to collision-induced muscle damage. DOMs be related to that high energy expenditure. One of my beliefs, so this is just hypothetical, no research to back this up, but we obviously know that with damaging training you get a repeat bout effect. As you would expect muscle damage to decrease, and as a consequence you'd probably expect total energy or calorific cost to decrease as well. And finally, all of those underestimations, prediction equations, the wearable technology, it doesn't account for collisions. Maybe that's why it's underestimating. So does muscle damage cause the collisions? Well, we showed that players were sore after the training session. Really interesting as well that we know impacts cause subclinical brain damage. We know that the brain tissue has protein synthesis rates about 3 times higher than lean tissue. So it's likely that muscle damage in the brain could be causing these high energy expenditures as well, or at least contributing. Again, really, really exciting data that we haven't published, looking at resting metabolic rate of a professional player before and after game. So before a game, after that game, there was a 600 calorie increase in his amount of energy he would need at rest just to maintain weight. We believe that's due to muscle damage from sustained during the game. What I think is really interesting as well is that he hadn't recovered 3 days later. 300 calorie decrease, but it's still higher than it was during the season. So what does that mean across the season? What does that mean for a young player potentially playing a lot? And essentially the take-home message is we want you guys to feel your athletes for the amount of damage we think that the exercise is going to cause. I want to finish with this final point. We always try and overdrive success, and if you think of behavior on an equilibrium, you have restraining actions which stop you from doing something and drivers which make you do something. Try and remove the restrictions, change their environment. If they're not eating enough, provide food. Make shakes. It doesn't have to be anything fantastic, it could just be milk. If you're doing a collision session, you know they're going to cause muscle damage or brain damage to some extent. You're going to need to account for that. You can't just eat enough for the training session.